Summary of If I Die in a Combat Zone by Tim Obrien. Tim O'Brien's memoir jumps back and forth in time, between the months before he goes to fight in the Vietnam War and his battle events in the field. In the beginning of the story, Obrien and a young man named Barney are walking through the bush while snipers keep shooting at them and they talk about home. In 1968, the summer after Obrien graduates from college, he gets his draft notice. But as a professor and a smart person, Obrien is against the Vietnam War for moral reasons. He thinks about running away from the draft, but he feels too responsible to his family and society to put them down by avoiding his job. Obrien's father fought in World War II, and many young men from his hometown in Minnesota fought in the Korean War. This taught him the importance of pride and duty from the time he was a child. Even so, Obrien feels like he never makes a choice to fight in the Vietnam War. Instead, he feels like the gravity of his community's standards pulls him into it. Obrien goes to basic training at Fort Lewis in Washington and finds out right away that he hates his higher officers' sense of manly swagger and blind nationalism. But he meets Eric, who is also smart and likes poems. They become friends because they both dislike the military and war. When Eric and Obrien both say they don't agree with the war on moral grounds, their superior officers and even the military priest, Edwards, call them cowardly and disturbed. During basic training, Obrien plans to leave the army and go to Sweden, via Canada and Ireland. Because Sweden does not send deserters back to the US, Obrien makes plans, gets a bus ticket to Canada, and goes to Seattle to escape. But he learns he can't because it would shame his family, his town, and his fellow trainees. Obrien thinks that, like Eric, he will be put in a support role, but instead, he is put in the General Army, which is the most dangerous job and fights on the front lines. After 2 months of training as an infantryman, he goes to Vietnam and joins Alpha Company, which is led by Captain Johansson. Obrien quickly learns that Alpha Company doesn't take war or death seriously, and the men don't seem to care what the real goal of the Vietnam War is. When Viet Cong rebels attack Obrien's unit and kill 2 Americans in Obrien's first week, the other troops don't think it's a big deal. Obrien goes on walks with Alpha Company through the Vietnamese jungles to set traps for Viet Cong forces. The land is full of mines, and many of Alpha Company's men are killed in quiet times when they are not in battle. During the fighting, Obrien sees a lot of people get hurt or killed by the battle. American troops sometimes torture Vietnamese people to get information out of them. During a particularly hard mission in a place called Pinkville, Alpha Company loses a lot of men and gets so angry that Obrien and his fellow soldiers start setting fire to Vietnamese towns to show how much they hate and despise the Vietnamese. Obrien thinks Captain Johansson is the bravest person he has ever met. He also thinks he is one of the few truly brave people in Vietnam, because he has a strong will and uses good sense. Johansson's men like him because he takes care of them well, especially when he doesn't do what his bosses tell him to do, like setting up dangerous and pointless ambushes, when he thinks it's not worth the risk. But Captain Johansson is finally moved to a different job and replaced by Captain Smith, who is overweight and hasn't been in the Navy long. Because Captain Smith is a new boss, he makes bad choices that kill a lot of people in Alpha Company. But Captain Smith never feels bad about the people he kills. He only feels bad about how this will hurt his military career. Captain Smith's bosses don't have to wait long to take away his charge. After Captain Smith leaves, Alpha Company moves to a small town in Vietnam that is near a lake. Obrien thinks that the beautiful lagoon must have once been a peaceful place, almost like a fairy story with a lagoon monster hiding in the water, but now it is surrounded by minefields and covered in razor wire. One night, an American military station nearby makes a mistake. During a regular practice run, they hit the lagoon village by accident with mortars, hurting 33 people and killing 13, including some children. As compensation, the US government gives the families of the dead a small amount of money, and Obrien thinks their army is worse than any swamp monster. Obrien gets a new job and moves away from the battlefront to work as a typist at the company offices. There, his life is quiet and calm. But Obrien works for Major Callicles, who has been in the military his whole life and is very traditional. He thinks that troops don't have enough guts these days. Things like weed, mustaches, and prostitutes are things that Callicles hates. When reporters come to Vietnam to look into the My Lai massacre, in which Alpha Company killed a lot of civilians a year before Obrien joined them, Major Callicles is angry with the reporters who say that killing citizens was immoral and a war crime. But when they leave, Major Callicles is told to help the military look into what happened. The study shakes Callicles' strong belief in the army's moral rightness, and he starts drinking a lot. Major Callicles gets more and more crazy. He spends hours searching their base for marijuana and, while drunk, drags Obrien and another soldier into the woods to set up an attack that doesn't work. Callicles ends up setting fire to a whorehouse, which gets him kicked out of their base of support and takes away his command. In 1970, Obrien finishes his time in the army and goes back to the United States. He doesn't find the trip home to be very exciting. Even though he feels like he has changed forever, the world doesn't seem to have changed much.
About the author. Tim Obrien was born in Austin, Minnesota, in 1946.
He spent his whole youth in a small town in rural Minnesota, and many of his books are set there. In 1968, Obrien got his BA in political science from a small liberal arts college.
He was then forced into the U.S. Army to fight in the Vietnam War.
Obrien was against the war on moral grounds, and he almost ran away to Sweden, which was one of the few European countries that wouldn't send American deserters back to the U.S. But he felt he owed it to his small Minnesota town to serve because he cared about it.
After a few months of basic training, Obrien was sent to Vietnam.
From 1969 to 1970, he was a foot soldier in the 23rd Infantry Division, the same group that killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese citizens in the My Lai massacre the year before.
Obrien lived through the Vietnam War and came back to the United States. He went to graduate school at Harvard University before getting a job as an intern at the Washington Post.
If I Die in a Combat Zone, Obrien's book about the Vietnam War, came out in 1973. This was the start of his writing career. Even though he never thought of himself as an expert on the Vietnam War, he wrote a number of important books about it over the next few decades, including the award-winning Going After Cacciato, 1978, and The Things They Carried, 1990. Obrien got married in 2001 and had his first child when he was 58 years old.
Dad's Maybe book is his most recent book.
It is a collection of letters to his two kids, so that they can get to know him as a man, even though he will be old by the time they are grown up. Obrien teaches at Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.